Episode 15, The Muslim Empires. Question 1. The three Muslim empires of the early modern period, the Ottoman, Safavid, and Mughal, were both religiously tolerant and intolerant. Explain this contradiction. The Ottoman, Safavid, and Mughal empires all drew legitimacy from Islam, yet they ruled over vast, ethnically and religiously diverse populations. Their success depended on balancing Islamic orthodoxy with political pragmatism, which is why they could be simultaneously tolerant and intolerant. The key to understanding the contradiction is that tolerance was strategic, not ideological. Each empire relied on non-Muslim subjects for labor, trade, administration, or tax revenue, and so they developed systems that permitted limited religious autonomy in exchange for loyalty and payment. The Ottomans, for example, used the millet system, allowing Christian and Jewish communities to govern themselves under their own laws so long as they paid the jizya tax and accepted Muslim supremacy. The Mughals, especially under Akbar the Great, pursued a policy of quote-unquote universal peace, integrating Hindus into imperial administration and abolishing the jizya altogether. Both empires recognized that stability required inclusion. At the same time, each state claimed to defend quote-unquote true Islam, which led to periodical intolerance when rulers sought to bolster legitimacy or appease religious elites. The Safavids enforced Shia orthodoxy and persecuted Sunnis and Sufis. The later Mughals under Aurangzeb reinstated discriminatory taxes and destroyed some Hindu temples. The Ottomans, though generally pragmatic, occasionally repressed heterodox groups like the Alevis or punished conversion away from Islam. Thus, their intolerance coexisted with tolerance because they both served imperial needs. Religious flexibility maintained order and revenue, while selective intolerance reinforced the ruler's divine mandate and placated conservative clerics. In short, these empires practiced tolerance as governance, not as principle, a pragmatic duality that allowed them to rule for centuries. Question 2. What is the role of the Mongols in the rise of the Ottoman Empire? When the Mongols invaded the Middle East in the 13th century, they destroyed the old centers of Islamic political power. The Seljuk Sultan of Rum in Anatolia collapsed after the Mongol victory at the Battle of Kose Dagh, leaving Anatolia fragmented into small Turkic principalities or beyliks. The Mongols ruled indirectly through these beyliks, demanding tribute but allowing them considerable autonomy. This power vacuum and political decentralization set the stage for one small frontier state, the Ottoman beylik under Usman I, to expand. In other words, the Mongols cleared the field. They crushed the great Muslim powers, the Abbasid Caliphate in 1258 and the Seljuks shortly after, but left behind a mosaic of competing minor states. When the Mongol Ilkhanate weakened in the 14th century, its authority over Anatolia faded, and local leaders like the Ottomans began absorbing their neighbors. The Ottomans rose partly because they occupied a strategic frontier between collapsing Mongol influence to the east and the declining Byzantine Empire to the west. The Mongol conquests also indirectly helped the Ottomans by displacing large populations of Turkic warriors and nomads westward into Anatolia. These migrants, many fleeing Mongol control, brought military skill, horses, and weapons, a ready-made pool of frontier fighters who became the manpower of early Ottoman expansion. So while the Mongols never directly ruled the Ottomans, their destruction of older powers, weakening of central authority, and forced migrations of Turkic peoples created the political and demographic conditions that allowed the Ottomans to emerge, consolidate, and ultimately dominate the region. Question 3. What role did militarism play in the development of the Ottoman Empire? As the empire matured, what socio-economic internal conflicts emerged, and how did this affect the stability of the empire? What role would the Janissaries play in this internal conflict? From its origins, the Ottoman Empire was fundamentally a military creation. It arose on the frontier between Islam and Christianity, the Byzantine borderlands of northwestern Anatolia, where warfare was both a livelihood and a source of legitimacy. The early Ottomans were Ghazis, or quote unquote holy warriors, who fused religious zeal with pragmatic conquest. Their state structure reflected this. Land was distributed through the Timar system, in which cavalrymen were granted estates in exchange for military service. The state itself became a military hierarchy, with the Sultan as the supreme commander and the bureaucracy organized to sustain war. Tax collection, logistics, and administration all served the military's needs. As the empire expanded, however, this martial system began to strain under its own weight. By the 16th and 17th centuries, the flow of land and booty that had supported the military aristocracy dried up. At the same time, population growth, inflation driven by New World silver, and corruption weakened the Timar system. A new class of bureaucrats and tax farmers emerged, creating tension between old warrior elites and the new moneyed administrators. Peasant unrest, declining agricultural production, and economic stagnation followed, a classic case of a militarized empire facing the limits of expansion. The Janissaries were originally an elite corps of slave soldiers, recruited through the devshirme, a process of taking Balkan Christian children, forcing them to convert to Islam, and training them from an early age to fill a variety of positions within the Ottoman state. They embodied both the empire's military genius and its eventual sclerosis. Early on, they were disciplined, loyal, and professional, a standing army that gave the Ottomans a substantial advantage over their feudal rivals. But as the empire matured, the Janissaries became increasingly politicized and hereditary, forming a powerful urban interest group. They resisted modernization, interfered in court politics, and periodically revolted when their privileges were threatened. By the 17th and 18th centuries, the Janissaries had transformed from an engine of imperial expansion into a conservative force defending their own status. Their opposition to reform crippled efforts to modernize the army and administration. Ottoman militarism created the empire, but it also bound it to a rigid, expansion dependent system. When conquest declined as a source of revenue, the social and economic contradictions of the system emerged, pitting the old military elite, the Janissaries, against reformist bureaucrats and provincial elites. The empire's inability to reconcile these competing interests led to internal stagnation, recurrent rebellion, and ultimately the slow erosion of Ottoman power. Question 4. What was the basis for the Ottoman state, and how would this eventually contribute to the decline of the empire? The Ottoman Empire had been founded on warfare and sustained by continual territorial expansion. When opportunities for new conquest disappeared and territories began to fall to rival powers, the resources needed to support its vast military and bureaucracy steadily dried up. The weakening of the administrative system that had once held the empire together became evident through widespread corruption among government officials. As central administrative authority eroded, provincial and local administrators began to withhold more revenue for their own use. Poorly supervised by Istanbul, many minor bureaucrats, often large landowners themselves, placed heavier tax burdens and labor demands on the peasants working their estates. These oppressive practices frequently led to unrest. In some areas, peasant revolts and mass flight from the countryside caused widespread abandonment of farmland and social disruption, further depleting the empire's economic and human resources. Question 5. Describe the Sunni-Shia split. The Sunni-Shia split in Islam originated as a political dispute over leadership after Muhammad's death in 632. but evolved into a profound theological and cultural division that endures to this day. When Muhammad died without naming a clear successor, the early Muslim community faced the question of who should lead. One group argued that leadership should go to the most qualified and consensus chosen member of the community. They supported Abu Bakr, Muhammad's close companion, who became the first caliph. These Muslims became Sunnis, from al-Sunnah, meaning people of tradition. Another group believed that leadership should remain in the Prophet's family, specifically with Ali ibn Abi Talib, Muhammad's cousin and son in law. They saw Ali and his descendants as divinely chosen to guide the community in both spiritual and political matters. These followers became the Shia, short for Shi'at Ali, the party of Ali. Over time, what began as a political disagreement deepened into a religious and doctrinal divide. Sunnis emphasized the authority of the caliphate and the collective interpretation of the Quran and Hadith by scholars. By contrast, Shiites developed the concept of the imamate, a line of divinely inspired leaders, imams, descended from Ali, who possessed special spiritual insight. The split was cemented by violence, particularly at the Battle of Karbala in 680 CE, in which Ali's son Hussein was killed by Umayyad forces. His martyrdom became a defining event in Shia identity, symbolizing resistance to tyranny and injustice. In essence, the Sunni Shia divide reflects two visions of legitimate authority in Islam, one based on communal consensus, the other on divine lineage, and has shaped centuries of political, religious, and cultural history across the Muslim world. Question 6. What is the significance of the Battle of Khaldiran in 1514? The battle marked the first major clash between the Sunni Ottoman Empire and the Shia Safavid Empire. The ultimate victory of the Ottomans crushed the idea that Shiite divine kingship could triumph militarily over Sunni secular power. From this point on, the divide was not only theological but geopolitical, with clear imperial boundaries: Sunni dominance in Anatolia and the Arab world, Shiite authority in Iran. The Safavid army was driven by religious zeal but lacked modern weaponry. The Ottomans, by contrast, had gunpowder artillery and firearms, technologies the Safavids had neglected. The decisive Ottoman victory at Khaldiran halted Safavid westward expansion and established Ottoman control over eastern Anatolia and northern Iraq. This also demonstrated the superiority of gunpowder warfare over traditional cavalry and mystic, faith-based militancy, a pattern repeated across the early modern world. Question 7. What characteristics of Akbar the Great set him apart from his predecessors and would ultimately lay the groundwork for Mughal success moving forward? Unlike his militarily brilliant but short-sighted predecessors, Akbar understood that conquest alone couldn't secure rule over India's vast diversity. He created a centralized and merit-based bureaucracy that tied nobles to the emperor through graded ranks, salaries, and land assignments. The system integrated both Muslim and Hindu elites into imperial service, stabilizing governance and ensuring loyalty. Akbar's policy of universal peace was revolutionary. He abolished the jizya tax on non-Muslims, welcomed Hindus, Jains, and Christians at his court, and sought to create an inclusive imperial ideology that transcended sectarian divides. His experiments in theology reflected his belief that religious harmony was essential to political unity. Akbar's genius lay in his pragmatism. He recognized that Hindus formed the majority of his subjects, and that cooperation, not coercion, was the key to stability. He arranged political marriages with Rajput princesses, promoted local autonomy under loyal regional rulers, and maintained an efficient taxation system. Finally, Akbar presided over a vibrant court culture that blended Persian, Central Asian, and Indian traditions. His reign saw the flourishing of Mughal architecture, painting, and literature, symbols of a confident cosmopolitan empire. Akbar succeeded because he transformed the Mughal Empire from a foreign dynasty ruling by conquest into a legitimate Indian empire ruling by consent. His combination of military strength, administrative innovation, and cultural openness laid the institutional and ideological foundations for Mughal dominance, a synthesis that his successors inherited but could never really fully match. Question 8. What key weaknesses were noted by Francois Bernier even at the height of Mughal power? Despite admiring the wealth and splendor of the Mughal Empire, Francois Bernier, the 17th century French traveler, identified key structural weaknesses that, in retrospect, foreshadowed its decline. Bernier criticized the land assignment system known as the jagir, arguing that because nobles held land revenue only at the emperor's pleasure, they lacked incentive to invest in long-term improvements. Fields were overtaxed, irrigation works neglected, and productivity suffered. He contrasted this with European property rights, where ownership encouraged ongoing development. Bernier noted that the emperor controlled all wealth and appointments, leaving no independent aristocracy or civic institutions. This hyper-centralized bureaucracy bred corruption, inefficiency, and court intrigue. Officials enriched themselves through bribes and graft, while provincial administrators often exploited peasants to maintain lavish lifestyles and pay court dues. He was struck by the paradox of enormous imperial wealth amid widespread poverty. Luxury and monumental architecture disguised an economy that relied on extractive taxation rather than productive commerce. He observed that artisans and peasants lived precariously, with little opportunity for upward mobility. Bernier argued that the Mughal state was held together not by institutions, but by personal allegiance to the emperor. When leadership weakened, centrifugal forces, ambitious nobles, regional governors, and local revolts threatened to tear it apart. Question 9. How did Aurangzeb's policies produce a sectarian divide that would haunt India to the present day? Aurangzeb departed dramatically from the religious tolerance of earlier emperors like Akbar and Jahangir, who had pursued universal peace and integrated Hindus into the imperial bureaucracy. Aurangzeb, a devout Sunni Muslim, viewed this pluralism as moral decline. He sought to restore Islamic orthodox to governance by enforcing Sharia-based law, expanding the role of the ulama, Islamic scholars, and reimposing the jizya tax on non-Muslims that Akbar had abolished. These measures signaled a clear shift from cultural integration to social hierarchy. Aurangzeb's religious conservatism coincided with imperial overreach. Regional wars drained the treasury and alienated local powers. His destruction of Hindu temples and replacement with mosques, sometimes punitive, sometimes symbolic, became highly provocative political gestures, fueling growing resentment among Hindu communities. These acts were selective and politically motivated rather than purely theological, but they blurred the line between political authority and religious identity, fostering an enduring narrative of Muslim rule as oppressive and exclusionary. This eroded the Mughal Empire's most remarkable achievement, its ability to govern a multi-religious population through shared participation in imperial institutions. Aurangzeb's policies didn't invent Hindu-Muslim tension, but they did institutionalize religious difference as a tool of governance. Later colonial administrators, particularly the British, of course, would exploit this division, codifying communal identities for their own purposes. In short, Aurangzeb's reign transformed the Mughal Empire from a cosmopolitan state that happened to be Muslim into a Muslim state that ruled a non Muslim majority, setting in motion sectarian divisions that would reverberate for centuries.